Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anita Levels. Thank you so much, Director Brothman. It's good to see everyone on this afternoon. I'm in the Pittsburgh regional area. I'm one of the civil rights outreach procs here in the Pittsburgh regional area. Where are you? It would be great if you could put your name and where you're affiliated with and what area of the Commonwealth you're here. It'd be great if you put that in the chat. Also, before we get going, we have our executive director here with us today. It's always an honor when we have our executive director, Chad Lassiter, here. We want him to give us some welcome this afternoon. So please, Executive Director Lassiter, great to hear you this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Anita. Happy New Year to everyone. Thank you for being here in the virtual beloved community space. We are excited about this social justice lecture series kickoff for the new year. I want to quote Henry Highland Garnett. He was an African-American abolitionist, a minister, educator, and orator. And he said, let your motto be resistance, resistance, resistance. And we may say to ourselves in this very moment, what are we resisting? In the words of Public Enemy and Chuck D, fight the powers that be. We're resisting being seduced into the challenges that we're seeing in this democracy without operating in truth, love, and kindness, and speaking back to the oligarchs and the plutocrats and all those that tried to divide us. This book is a book that we have purchased, 20 of them. If anyone at the PHRC would like a copy of this book, we'll purchase more. But this social justice lecture series was born out of a car conversation that my chief of staff, Zulay Rojas, and I had, where she brought this book to my attention. We ordered the book off of Amazon, and we're so humbled and honored that a year later, what gave birth to a conversation is now coming to fruition. Once again, Happy New Year. Thank you for being in this space. Thank you for those of you who at PHRC are negotiating, your identities of, investigating civil rights complaints that come in, and you took the time away briefly for this. It's not an either or here at PHRC, it's a both and. We want you to do your work, but this is also really, really something that we want people to partake of. Lastly, I want to thank ASL. I want to thank ASL because it's not only just a science and discipline, it's a blessing to have ASL here. And we're happy that we're able to put this on because now we have a budget to do so. Welcome, Professor Hernández. We're really, really excited to have you. And I want to take the social justice baton and hand it back over to Anita Levels.
Thank you again, Executive Director Lassiter. Appreciate that. And welcome again, you all, for being here for our Lunch and Learn of Understanding Latino Anti-Blackness through the lens of equality law. As we're moving forward, as Executive Lassiter mentioned, our Chief of Staff, Zulay Rojas, who's going to do our bio for Professor Hernández. So we're going to hand that off to our Chief of Staff to do the bio.
Thank you, OC Levels. I appreciate it. Tanya Katerí Hernández es profesora de Derecho Archibald R. Murray en la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad de Fordham, donde imparte clase de Derecho Antidiscriminatorio, Discriminación Laboral Comparado, Teoría Crítica de la Raza, Escritura y Reivindicación de la Raza y la Esfera Pública, la Ciencia del Sesgo Implícito y el Derecho, Nuevos Caminos hacia la Justicia Social y Fideicomisos y Testamentos. Obtuvo su licenciatura en la Universidad de Brown y su doctorado en Derecho en la Facultad de Derecho de Yale, donde fue editora de temas de artículos del Yale Law Journal. La profesora Hernández es una experta en Derecho Comparado de la Raza, reconocida internacionalmente y becaria Fulbright, que ha sido profesora visitante en la Universidad Paris-Nanterre-la-Défense en París y en la Facultad de Derechos de la Universidad de las Indias Occidentales en Trinidad. Anteriormente fue becaria de Derechos y Asuntos de Políticas Públicas en la Universidad de Princeton, becaria docente en el Instituto de Investigación sobre la Mujer de la Universidad de Rutgers, becaria docente en el Centro Fred T. Korematsu para el Derecho y la Igualdad y académica residente en el Centro Schomburg para la Investigación de la Cultura Negra. La profesora Hernández es miembro de la American Bar Foundation, del American Law Institute y de la Academia Puertorriqueña de Jurisprudencia y Legislación. La revista Hispanic Business la seleccionó como una de las 100 hispanas más influyentes del año. Y el Contralor de la Ciudad de Nueva York, Brad Lander, le otorgó una mención honorífica por sus extraordinarias contribuciones a la lucha contra el racismo. La profesora Hernández forma parte de los consejos editoriales de la revista brasileña de Derecho y Justicia Brazilian Journal of Law and Justice y del Latino Studies Journal, publicado por Palgrave Macmillan Press. El interés académico de la profesora Hernández se centra en el estudio de las relaciones raciales comparadas y derecho antidiscriminatorio. Y su trabajo en esta área se ha publicado en numerosas revistas jurídicas universitarias como Cornell, Harvard, NYU, UC, Berkeley, Yale, y en medios de comunicación como el New York Times, entre otras publicaciones, incluyendo sus libros Racial Subordination in Latin America, The Role of the State, Customary Law and the New Civil Rights Response, con ediciones traducidas al español y al portugués. Raw Research Perspectives and Comparative Law, Racial Discrimination, and Multiracials and Civil Rights, Mixed Race Stories of Discrimination. Su libro más reciente publicado por Beacon Press es Racial Innocence, Unmasking Latino Anti-Black Bias and the Struggle for Equality, y su edición en español, Inocencia Racial, Desenmascarando la Antinegritud de los Latinos y la lucha por la igualdad. Actualmente tiene su contrato con Beacon Press para la publicación de su próximo libro, Undercounting Blackness Across the Globe, The Civil Rights Crisis of Census Racial Erasure. Without further ado, please put your virtual hand claps together for Professor Tanya Katerí Hernández.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome. I have to say, when I first got the invitation, I immediately was very excited. If anyone has noticed the back wall, Pennsylvania has a special part in my heart, particularly Pittsburgh, for Roberto Clemente. And so I grew up with him as my hero, and it's always, anyway, it's special to me that Pennsylvania made room for him. Okay, so can you all hear me now?
Sí.
Yeah, my screen was saying I'd been muted. I don't know what happened. But here I am, and very glad to be here. I do have a PowerPoint slideshow so that you just don't get bored watching my face speak on a screen, which I know can be sort of tiresome in our virtual world. So let me get that showing, and then we can have a nice little chat afterwards. Okay, let me make sure I'm sharing the proper thing. Okay. PowerPoint slideshow. Otherwise, you all can let me know in the chat box whether there is a technical problem. Okay, wonderful. So let me begin. An important challenge for racial justice that we face in our society today that frequently gets overlooked is the anti-Black bias that can exist in communities themselves considered ethnic and racial minorities. Indeed, the conundrum of how anti-Black violence can be so pervasive decades after the achievements of the civil rights movement cannot be readily understood nor addressed with the traditional sole focus on white Anglo individuals. In the language of the U.S. Census Bureau, non-Hispanic whites are presently only about 58% of the population and declining in numbers. Now, some funny business with the census, but that's for another conversation. This means that the ongoing upkeep and silent acceptance of anti-Blackness implicates many other racial and ethnic groups. Exploring complicity in anti-Blackness, though, seems like a puzzle in the traditional equality frame for understanding constitutional law and anti-discrimination law. So nice to be in an audience that knows what I'm talking about here. As a multi-hued ethnic group, Latinos are often viewed as free of racism, or at least free of its most exclusionary forms, because they were not viewed as part of the civil rights, or I should say the Civil War post-emancipation origins of the Equal Protection Clause. However, examining how anti-Blackness still does manage to manifest itself amongst the racially mixed rainbow of Latinos in the equality claims of Afro-Latinos and other people of African descent is a powerful illustration of how people of color themselves can fortify racism. The January 6th terrorist attack on the U.S. Capitol included several members of the Latino, of the white supremacist group, the Proud Boys, and along with their chairman, Cuban-American Enrique Dario, who was sentenced to 22 years in prison for the central role that he played in organizing his followers to attack the Capitol. He was pardoned along with the rest of them. Just as the white supremacist violence in Charlottesville, Virginia, back in 2017 also included Latino attackers. The Southern Poverty Law Center has noticed that there's an increasing trend of more media reports of Latinos joining white supremacist groups and of Latino lone gunmen aspiring to be members, as was Mauricio Garcia of Allen, Texas, who killed 8 people and injured 7 others in a Dallas area mall mass shooting. The racial violence is also evident amongst white Latino law enforcement members. Many people remember the name Sandra Bland, and they know that that was a white supremacist law enforcement murder incident, yet very few know that it was a Latino white law enforcement officer. Same with Philando Castile in Minnesota, and the many other incidents that never make it to the mass media national reporting. And yet Latino law enforcement members are not the only problem. We see that in Latino opponents to hashtag Black Lives Matter. White Latino supremacists are not the only problem. Anti-Blackness also shows up in Latino communities against Afro-Latinos, African Americans, and other people of African descent in a myriad of contexts, such as the workplace, the rental and purchase of homes, educational settings, public spaces of leisure, and the criminal justice system. Examining Latino agency in anti-Blackness helps us better understand the complexities of racism and what is needed to be effective in an increasingly racially diverse world. Now, before I discuss how Latino anti-Black bias surfaces in anti-discrimination law cases in the U.S., I think it'll be helpful if I first do sort of a quick little recap about the origins of Latino anti-Black bias. Over 90% of the approximately 10.7 million enslaved Africans forcibly brought to the Americas were taken to Latin America and the Caribbean, whereas only approximately 3.5% were brought to what we now call the United States. Today, there are approximately 150 million people of African descent in Latin America, representing about 1/3 of the total population. And these are considered very conservative demographic figures, given the long history of undercounting Black people on national census forms in Latin America, or sometimes completely omitting a race and ethnic origin census question, hence the next book. But anyway, at the same time, people of African descent make up more than 40% of the poor in Latin America and have been consistently marginalized and denigrated as undesirable elements of the society since the abolition of slavery across the Americas. Yet constitutional equality law in Latin America contributes to the view that racism does not exist, which is pervasive in the region, despite the advent of social justice movements and social science researchers demonstrating the contrary. When the BBC surveyed Latin Americans regarding the existence of racism, a significant number of respondents emphatically denied it. Many, for instance, made statements such as, Latin America is not racist, we're not a racist region, because we are all mixed. Thus, the denial of racism is rooted in what many scholars have critiqued as the myth of racial democracy. That is, the notion that racial mixture, mestizaje, in a population is emblematic of racial harmony and insulated from racial discord and inequality. Academic scholarship in at least the last 30 years or more have critiqued these mestizaje theories of racial mixture. Yet Latin Americans on the ground still very much adhere to the notion that racial mixture and the absence of Jim Crow racial segregation are such a marked contrast to the U.S. racial history that the region views itself as what I call racially innocent. And too many judges in Latin America have long relied upon these ideas when automatically dismissing discrimination claims without investigation. In part, the absence of a legal critique of the Latin American comparisons to the Jim Crow U.S. has enabled this racial innocence stance to remain. An earlier book provides the legal critique. Specifically, this book is about the ways in which the Latin American denial of racism, operating in conjunction with the notion that true racism can only be found in the racial segregation of the U.S., veils the actual instances of racism in Latin America. The book argues that looking at the role of the state after the abolition of slavery and regulating race through immigration law and customary law disrupts this picture of Latin America as racially innocent. The book assesses the ways in which the contemporary Latin American anti-discrimination legal structure seeks to eradicate the legacy of racial inequality wrought by the historic racism of the state. Today, the force of racism denial is so strong in Latin America that the very term negro, black, is widely considered derogatory because people of African descent are stereotyped and referred to as inherently criminal, intellectually inferior, overly sexual, and animalistic. Hence the stamp that was in circulation in Mexico. Because the racialized stereotypes of Black people are pervasive, they are commonly understood to smell like animals, and in particular, monkeys. In addition to these commonalities in anti-Black stereotypes across Latin America, each country in the region has developed its own subset of derogatory phrases for Blacks and Blackness. A review of newspapers in the region meticulously traced how racialized stereotypes for Blacks and anti-Black sentiment is pervasive across media outlets. When I share this information about anti-Blackness in Latin America, a frequent response makes note of how Blackness is also used as a term of affection. So if this is occupying space in your brains, let me address it right now. The use of racialized language as terms of endearment still unconsciously and sometimes consciously invokes the paternalism of slavery's past. Let me give you some examples. When expression of affection is expressed by saying, that's my Black person, or calling somebody my little Black person, mi negrito, even compliments directed towards those who are Black are reserved for those who are presumed to supersede their Blackness by having superior traits. So compliments like, he's Black, but has the soul or the heart of a white person. She's Black, but good looking. He's Black, but well-groomed and scented. These are compliments. They are well-intentioned compliments, right? They're not meant to carry malice. Yet they still activate racial stereotypes about the inferiority of Blackness. We don't have a whole slew of equivalents for white people in the Spanish language. In fact, these racialized perspectives about Black people are so embedded in the social fiber of Latin American societies that the subordinated status of Black people is viewed as natural and logical, and racial exclusion is explained away as only about poverty and poor education alone. Moreover, when flagrant instances of racist conduct are detailed in Latin American news media, they are understood as the acts of aberrant individuals who do not represent the greater tolerance presumed to be part of the Latin American culture. Indeed, Latin American racial denial is deeply embedded within racially hierarchical environments. This dualism has historically been facilitated by the deployment of strategic comparisons to the U.S. racial regime that are meant to depict Latin America as, again, innocent of perpetrating racism. Call that, again, the rhetoric of racial innocence. All of which is to say that the legacy of slavery, with its anti-Black justifications, is just as relevant to the Latin American context as it is to the U.S. So when people from Latin America and the Caribbean migrate to the U.S., they bring along their racialized baggage with them and transmit it across generations into U.S. Latino culture. If we are going to call food, music, dance, how we dress, culture, then racial attitudes also have to be considered part of culture. Now, as disturbing as is the anti-Black aspects of Latin American, Caribbean national cultures, for many Afro-Latinos in the United States, the deepest racial scars are those that are inflicted within intimate familial structures. When it comes to Latino racism, the family is the scene of the crime. Racial trauma is instilled when Latino parents show preferential treatment to children with lighter skin and consistently make negative appraisals of Black racialized facial features, skin color, and hair texture. Upon adolescence, the familial vigilance against Blackness is intensified in the Latino project of pursuing and/or maintaining a semblance of whiteness. The obsession with mejorando y adelantando la raza, that is improving and advancing the race by marrying lighter and ideally whiter partners, means each potential suitor is sorted out for taints of Blackness. Yet anti-Black racism that arises outside the unfortunately familiar U.S. frame of Anglo-white versus African-American bias can be mystifying for many people in the U.S. And this is in part because U.S. Blackness is primarily conceived of as embodied solely by English-speaking African Americans. In turn, anti-Blackness is properly understood as a uniquely U.S. phenomena, affecting those English-speaking African Americans. Once in a while, we have a recognition of the racialized struggles of Africans and other peoples from the African diaspora. Civil rights leaders are also seemingly reticent to air the dirty laundry of the bias that exists within communities of color, lest it distract from what is thought of as the real racism of white supremacy. However, all the while, Afro-Latinos, African Americans, and many others suffer from the acts of discrimination at the hands of Latinos who claim that their racially mixed cultures and backgrounds immunize them from being racist. And that's why I brought along the term of racial innocence from my prior book into this one to describe Latino racial innocence, a cloak that veils Latino complicity in U.S. racism. In turn, the public ignorance about Latino anti-Blackness undermines the ability to fully address the interwoven complexities of U.S. racism in developing public policies and enforcing anti-discrimination law. Judges and the rest of society need to learn that Latinos can be racist too. So in the book that you have some copies of, and that is now also available in Spanish for people who you would like to share with in Spanish, I excavate the otherwise silenced voices of Afro-Latino and African-American victims and others of Latino anti-Blackness from the case files of discrimination charges. And the reason why I do that is because it makes concrete what so many Latinos want to deny. When they see it in a case, they get more real about it. In examining how discrimination claims of Latino anti-Blackness arise, two central patterns become evident. First, Latino anti-Blackness is more prevalent and serious in its consequences than many commentators in politics and the media care to admit. Second, the ability to identify and address Latino anti-Blackness is hampered by the notion that Latinos cannot be prejudiced or racist simply by virtue of being Latino. It is for this reason that the tales of Latino anti-Black discrimination recounted in court cases are so important, inasmuch as they help disrupt the Latino myth of racial innocence and clarify Latino agency in racism. The interrogation of the Latinos can't be prejudiced pseudo-defense to racism is especially illuminating for the legal enforcement of anti-discrimination law. Let me give you a couple of examples. When Eddie Frazier, an African-American man, wanted to rent an apartment in a suburban community in Long Island, New York, specifically Smithtown, it was a Latino homeowner who refused to consider his application. The Latino landlord instead chose to wait 3 more months for a non-Black applicant to surface. If any of you who have ever been landlords, or family or friends have been landlords, you know that sacrificing 3 months of a rent roll is not in your best interest. Mortgages are difficult to pay, bills are difficult to pay. Yet this landlord decided it made more sense to sacrifice that in order to have racial purity in a tenant. Yet a jury was persuaded that no racial discrimination had occurred due to the fact that the owner was a Brazilian who denied harboring racial bias because she was of mixed race heritage and many of her Brazilian relatives had Black and Indian ancestry. And so, I can't be racist. I'm a Latina who's mixed, was her way out, and the juries went for it. Juries alone, though, are not unique in being misled about Latino agency and racism. I'll give you another example. Maxine Sprott, an African-American woman who worked as a deputy director of the New York City Housing Authority Office of Equal Opportunity, NYCHA, our projects, alleged that her Hispanic supervisor, office director Rosalyn Reyes, harassed her with derogatory comments about her work performance, despite Maxine repeatedly receiving positive performance evaluations. She also insinuated that Maxine, despite having educational background from Cornell University in equal employment opportunity study, that she did not have a grasp of the nature of her work as it related to identifying and investigating acts of discrimination. I'm sure this must hit quite home for you all here in the audience. Each positive performance evaluation rating from Director Reyes was then followed with commentary about Maxine's lack of leadership skills in her role as deputy director. She then excluded Maxine from various office meetings and functions. When Maxine could no longer withstand the onslaught of derogatory commentary about her competence, she filed a claim of discrimination with the general manager of NYCHA. Exactly 3 days after Maxine filed her discrimination claim, Director Reyes submitted a performance evaluation that for the very first time rated Maxine as marginal, resulting in Maxine being denied a managerial merit salary increase. Any expectations that Maxine might have had that working for a city equal opportunity division focused on addressing discrimination in public housing, that this would be a more racially enlightened workplace, these ideas were shredded when her employer not only failed to investigate her allegations initially, but then retaliated against her for filing a claim. In fact, it was yet another Latino NYCHA official, Chairman Ruben Franco, that discriminatorily retaliated against Maxine. To be specific, when Maxine insisted on following through with her claim, Director Reyes informed her that she was going to be transferred to another office where her material responsibilities were diminished, and she was moved out of a well-furnished private office into a cubicle. You all don't need me to describe to you what a constructive discharge looks like to understand that when you are moved out of your private office where you can have a sandwich in private during lunch, make a call home in private from your phone to make sure that everyone at home is safe and sound, that's not the same thing as being in a cubicle in a white public space, right? This is yet another instance of retaliation for Maxine's exercise of her right to assert a claim of discrimination. Only when she goes through with filing the claim in court is she then able to reach a settlement agreement with NYCHA and receive financial compensation. Now, you may be wondering, why am I using this example to talk about judges? Any number of concerns may have influenced Maxine and her attorney to settle the case rather than to move forward with a jury trial. But one contributing factor could very well have been the great significance the judge placed upon the office racial diversity as mitigating claims of discrimination. Let me explain. For the judge, it was immaterial that when Chairman Franco transferred Maxine to this effectively lesser position in the cubicle, at the same time that he was firing 2 other African-American women, all as part of his ostensible reorganization plan, that this was not related one thing to another and not worthy of inquiry. Instead, the judge concluded that these facts failed to raise an inference of discrimination because the new director is a Hispanic woman, I'm quoting. The remaining staff is comprised of 24 Hispanics and 23 African Americans. So the judge here is according a Latino-dominated workplace and the supervisor's Hispanic status great power in of themselves to circumvent racism. Here then is the judicial presumption that Latino co-workers and supervisors cannot be the bearers of racism. A corollary of the judicial presumption that Latino co-workers cannot be bearers of racism is the judicial notion that all Latino places of origin are racial equivalents. The Dominican Republic is the same as Argentina, is the same as Ecuador, is the same as Panama. The case of Arrocha versus CUNY helps spell this out. Jose Arrocha, a self-identified Afro-Panamanian tutor of Spanish, sued his university employer for failure to renew his appointment as an adjunct instructor. Jose alleged that the Latinos who directed the department where he worked discriminated against Black Hispanics. These are his words. And that there was a disturbing culture of favoritism that favored the appointments of what he called white Cubans, Spaniards, and white Hispanics from South America. Yet the court dismissed his claims, in my view, because there was not an understanding of the ways in which a color hierarchy maps onto how Latinos experience racism and national origin from other Latinos who are not viewed as a homogeneous pan-ethnic grouping within the group itself. Let me give you some more detail. The dismissal of the case was justified based on the fact that 5 of the 8 adjunct instructors that were reappointed instead of Jose were natives of other South and Central American countries such as Argentina, Peru, Mexico, and the Dominican Republic. The judge explicitly stated in the court opinion that diversity in an employer's staff undercuts an inference of discriminatory intent, which is not the actual law from statute or established case law. Instead, the judge inferred non-discrimination from the presumption that Latino ethnic subgroups are interchangeable and homogeneous. This perspective fails to appreciate the ways in which internal Latino national origin bias is rooted in a racialized hierarchy of Latin American countries, where countries perceived or touted as European are viewed as more advanced than those more significantly populated with people of indigenous descent and African descent. So let's go back to that list of countries where the judge found them to all be the same, indicating the absence of national origin bias. Latin American racial constructs would rank Argentina as a highly valued white country, followed by Peru and Mexico with its indigenous population domination, and most derided would be the Dominican Republic and the claimant's own country of origin of Panama because of their dominance by African-descended peoples. For Latinos, influenced by Latin American racial paradigms, where each country has a racial identification, a diverse workforce of Latinos is not the immediate equivalent of a bias-free context, nor is a color preference divorced from a racialized ideology within the Latino context. So sometimes I often get asked, well, isn't it just about colorism? Well, colorism is not divorced from racism. It's not a nicer form of racism. It is also important to note that Latino anti-Black bias shows up not only as an expression of Latino individual racial attitudes, but also in systemic structures of intentional exclusion. Before I wrap up, let me share one more example. Latino employees of a Chicago-based nationwide job placement agency described how their Latino supervisors trained them to exclude African American applicants from job placements in favor of Latino applicants. They were instructed to automatically reject all Black people because of the stereotype that they were not capable of working as hard as Latinos. And notice the juxtaposition. Latinos is viewed as mutually exclusive from Blacks. But anyway, the lawsuit details how dispatchers who nevertheless sent African American job seekers to a company would later be reprimanded by their Latino bosses for doing so. The placement agency would start the day by separating Hispanic job applicants from African American. They would enter the Hispanic applicants' contact information into a database so they could be easily reached when job offers opened up. African American applicants did not receive the same treatment. Instead, they were instructed to go to an office at dawn to wait for assignments that rarely ever came. One agency dispatcher testified, and here I'm quoting, "If it was 10 Mexicans that would come at 1:30 p.m. and 25 African Americans that were there at 4:30 in the morning and were waiting to be sent to work, the agency would send the Mexicans first." This Latino-run employment agency effectively ensured a secondary racial caste system of Latino over Black in the already segregated Chicago area labor market that privileges Anglo-whiteness. So to wrap up, before I take questions from you all, I'd like to address a concern I often hear, and that maybe is plaguing you as well, that people of color cannot be racist because they do not have power. Okay, but when Latinos, and other people of color for that matter, are active participants in the denial of access to an important life opportunity, a home, a job, an unimpeded education, fairness in the criminal justice system, entrance into public spaces, based on race, these Latinos are no longer just passive holders of an anti-Black cultural prejudice. They are part of the problem of racism. Their actions make them part of the problem of racism. Certainly, none of the victims of anti-Black bias in the narratives of discrimination that I've shared with you today and that I examine in much greater detail in the book would be placated with the disclaimer, "Your experience is not an example of racism because Latinos don't have the systemic power to be racist in white Anglo-created structures." One could immediately envision such a victim sort of responding back, "Oh yeah, that so-called non-racist Latino is the one who put their foot on my neck for being Black." A Latino claim of racial innocence in the racist world white Anglos created in the US is a very thin reed of moral superiority when a Latino hand is the one forcefully slamming the door to Black inclusion. But the book is much more than just a call for recognizing that Latinos can be prejudiced too. Rather, it is an entreaty for all future interventions into matters of racism to critically engage how Latinos and many others collaborate and sustain structures of racism. By recognizing they are part of the problem, interventions can also address Latinos as part of the solution. Judges and juries can be taught to desist from being distracted by the "I can't be racist, I'm a Latino" pseudo-defense to accusations of discrimination. In short, dismantling racism in the U.S. requires that every component of its structures be taken apart, even the ones articulated en español, in Spanish. We do this by becoming racially literate about Latino anti-Blackness, like you all are doing right now, and engaging in meaningful coalition work. So to end on a nice up note, let me give you some examples of such coalition work. Here from a immigration-focused national nonprofit. Here from a Los Angeles specific community coalition. Let's think back to the 1992 LA uprisings. and here a Northeast Boston-based coalition group. So I'd like to thank you very much for inviting me to be here with you in community. And I'm happy to take questions or just hear your own kinds of, how should I put this? Testimonies. I have found that often when I share my work that people don't necessarily have formulated questions because they're processing, but what they do have is sort of a visceral reaction to identification, things that have happened to them, things that they've observed, and they need a space to be able to share that because they've never been able to do that before. So I'm happy to be that safe space. Let me take down the PowerPoint slide so I can see your all faces more clearly.
Thank you so much, Professor Hernandez. You all can, if anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to raise your hand or put them in the chat. I'm overwhelmed. I've never, I mean, of course, you're a scholar and academic in this, but what you just presented was just so A plus. And so I'm overwhelmed by everything that you just presented. So I'm still digesting it myself. So any comments, questions, please go for it. Well,
I'm all inspired, as you just stated, Anita, just reflecting. I've read the book, but to have it actualized, I'm just very thankful. I think in this moment, not that I think, I know that in this moment that we're in, it's going to take coalition building to speak back against a lot of the ways that we're seduced into either the black-white binary, the intra racism, the meta racism, all of that. And so just very, very appreciative of your presentation today, and just a lot of social justice food for thought to just reflect throughout the rest of the day. I'd be curious to hear from our Deputy Director, Adrian Garcia, as well as one of our outreach coordinators, Hector, who oftentimes are always centering the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission on the needs of this population. I think they were okay with me in a very loving and kind way, having them to step into this space to ask questions, because Deputy Director Garcia talks about the duality of, oppression versus various things. And if he's on, I would love to have him hold space, because we're always having these type of conversations. But thank you so much, Professor. Just stellar presentation. Thank you. Thank you from the bottom of my social justice heart.
Oh, happy to do that. Before anyone else steps in, I did see a quick question come up over the chat, I think from Devin. And so if I could respond to that, because it's one that I often get. Is that okay?
Certainly.
Okay. So I'm going to reformulate Devin's question, and he'll let me know whether, or they will let me know whether I got this accurately. And that is, what about the other side? And in my reformulation of the question, what that is essentially, oh, you're talking about all this Latino anti-Black business. What about them? What about them? Which Latinos are often the ones who raise this issue. What about African Americans or other people of African descent who are anti-Latino? Why didn't I write about a book about that? Or why didn't I write, include extra chapters about that in my book? Well, the reason why I didn't include all of that is because courts don't have any confusion about that. When it comes to examining any kind of allegation of wrongdoing that identifies a Black person, an African American person, courts got no problem investigating what they think are problematic attitudes on part of Black people. In my view, theoretically, that's also a part of anti-Blackness, meaning this predisposed willingness to look for wrongdoing amongst Black people. Now, I'm not here to say that there aren't claims that are actually meritorious, just as there are some claims that are not meritorious of people saying that there's anti-Blackness amongst Latinos, right? Meaning you all, this audience in particular, knows that these are matters that need to be inquired into, need evidentiary data for, etc. What my inquiry, though, is very much about the ways in which there is a resistance to doing any of that kind of investigation when it is a Latino who is accused of bias. When it is an African American is accused of bias, it's like, oh yeah, they can be racist too. The greater public discourse does not have any difficulty being able to conceptualize. And so there is, in some respects, a lack of symmetry that people would otherwise think would be sort of just a default for this kind of a matter. So I hope, Devin, that sort of explains the focus of the book. But if you want to follow up, just let me know.
Thank you, Professor Hernandez. Another comment here is saying it's really good to hear someone talking about this. Who's this? This is Sela Luesa. I hope I'm saying that properly. Is talking about this. I used to work in a Brazilian company. Brazilian coworkers were racist and would always comment about Black people, saying that they were different than the ones back in their country, and they were never able to understand that. Thank you for your comment. So Devin just says thank you. They're agreeing with what you're saying, Professor Hernandez. So thank you for commenting about that. Thank you.
I lived in Brazil for a period of time. And so I'm very familiar with this dynamic and the equivalence within the Luso-Brazilian culture about mestiçagem, which in Portuguese is mestiçagem. So yes, I know all about this too.
Do you believe the anti-Blackness that we're seeing here has something to do with within the culture, has something to do with the wanting to be in the proximity of whiteness, or do you think it's the because I look at propaganda of even Jim Crow that happened. I mean, Jim Crow, that character went over to France to give reason for enslavement to Black folks here in America. Just that propaganda to say, hey, I know we're treating Black folks here wrong with enslavement, but we have to spread that propaganda to dehumanize that. It was like that media coverage. Even then, I took that Jim Crow character to even across the waters and to France to give reason for the maltreatment of Black folks in enslavement. And so I think of like the propaganda of even in the space of South America and Mexico of like, do you think that the anti-Blackness is the proximity to whiteness, that anti-Blackness is there, is a propaganda? Why do you think anti-Blackness within the community is present? Do you think, is there a root cause of that?
Well, I mean, this is why I always like to make sure that even though I'm not immediately jumping into the details of the Racial Innocence book, that I go circle back to what I like to call sort of volume 1, which is the Racial Subordination in Latin America book. Because while, of course, this is sort of like a nuanced, multi-layered dynamic or phenom, of anti-Black bias, its origins are not solely one of these, oh, America taught me, the United States taught me how to be racist, or in the United States, I have more incentive to be racist, though certainly that's a layer, like Toni Morrison talked about that, very early on. What I like to make sure that people have clarity about is that anti-Black bias long preceded any propaganda, right, on the part of the U.S. in its incursions into Latin America. Talk about an appropriate moment to be talking about this. Because Latin America itself was already a much larger part of the transatlantic slave trade. That meaning European colonialism, Spanish, Portuguese, etc., was already sort of infusing these spaces with anti-Blackness. We didn't have to wait until becoming immigrants to come to the United States to hear any of that. So it's not new. Now, that being said, it is not inconsequential that entering into the United States, even if you look like a white person who is from Norway or Sweden, etc., the light eyes, the light hair, the light skin, etc., because I got Black people in Norway and Sweden as well, so I need to be specific. Right? Even if that was what you look like as a Latina or Latino coming into the United States, you do experience a racialization because of your last name. When people hear Hernández, it is not a neutral, excuse me, reaction. It's not the same thing to say Smith. Hernández is racialized in the U.S. So that is to say, white Latin Americans and people from the Caribbean who only ever thought of themselves as white in their home space, entering to the U.S., are confronted with being viewed as and treated as less than white. And so for them, it is a more complicated affair and a greater level of incentive to want to demarcate any kind of connection to Blackness and the particular stereotypes of anti-Blackness regarding African Americans in the U.S. So all of it is truly connected, but I wouldn't ever want to say that it's only about the propaganda of U.S. when there's sort of centuries of that have preceded this context within Latin America and the Caribbean.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank
OC
you.
Levels, I think Hector has his hand up for a while.
Oh, sure.
So, good afternoon, Professor Hernández. I'm Hector Torres Diaz. So, I have a question and a comment for you. So, it was, I guess, piggybacking off Devin Price's initial question. And do you think that that particular, like, why not the other side look comes from the fact that Latinos in generally do a good job at selling this facade that we're so united and that we love each other so greatly and that we're gonna come here and we're gonna always hang around each other, when in reality, even within our own organizations based on our own ethnicities within national origin, we tend to have that pyramid of who's the most superior Latino versus who's the least. Like, is that maybe part of that, like, misconception that maybe the courts have, or like maybe the society has, with identifying this anti-Black bias and even like prejudice amongst ourselves?
I think it's that, but also a combination of, one, our own propaganda as Latinos within the United States, but also the ways in which a Black-white binary in the United States creates the sense of like, well, Latinos are not exactly white, but they're not exactly Black, because they don't know that whiteness and Blackness and Asian and indigenous ancestry all exist within Latin America and the Caribbean, right? Meaning that we have our own Black-white binaries within our countries of origin. And so this lack of literacy, right, about racialization within Latin America and the Caribbean also creates this sense of, well, they don't actually fit our paradigm, and so that means that their actions cannot be pigeonholed into our racialized understandings of what is discrimination. And that's why I always make this plug for literacy in order to be part of the path forward for getting judges to get it right.
And then my comment is, I don't know if you saw that the Harvard University Club had unveiled this portrait of Pedro Albizu Campos a couple months ago.
No.
And so that photo itself was like a slightly, I guess, a debate to a degree based on who he was. He was, one of the first Afro-Latinos to ever graduate from Harvard, top of his class, spoke 7 languages. And when they finally unveiled his photo, although he was an Afro-Boricua, they lightified his skin, if you will. And so it was like a mix of, like, the students that unveiled it. It wasn't necessarily Hispanics. There weren't really any African Americans on this board. So what are your thoughts as to why, even though we have all of these images of him, even though we have these historical contexts, and it's not like he's new or so to speak unknown, why are we still doing that when it is blatantly obvious that that's not what he looked like? And then you refine his features to make him look more European when that's not what he looked like.
Right. I mean, I think this is in some respects sort of the photoshopping mindset of the world, right? Long before we had photoshopping, there was still, right, this notion of, well, if you are someone who I am acknowledging as a person who's contributed in some way, right? You are a leader, you are an intellect, etc. Then cognitively, it does not compute. There's a cognitive dissonance between that admission and recognizing the Blackness of the person, right? So it's sort of almost like, oh, I'm doing you a favor by depicting you not as you actually were, but as I perceive your intellect to be. It heads back to those compliments within the Latino culture of, like, oh, Black but so smart, right? Black but so beautiful. Right? These two things can't coexist. Right? So it's always as an explanation for why you're accepted in the group, despite your Blackness. And so doing the portrait, I mean, I know nothing about the details, and so I'm quite fascinated to hear this from you. Not being a Harvard person, that the beautifying, right, the photoshopping is a very racialized endeavor, even if it wasn't self-perceived as such.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I think we have just one. It's 12:59, and I know that we're to close about 1 o'clock. But I do want to just take just one last question, if that's okay with you, Professor Hernandez. Okay. From Devin again. In the last 10 years, there's been violence at Harrisburg High School, and it seems to be between African American students and Latino students. And he's asking, what can we advise them to teach the kiddos to resolve their issues? There have been fights between two of the African American kids and Latino kids. What can we advise them to help them resolve their issues?
Right. Well, this is unfortunately not a novel dynamic, right? The West Coast, because of their sort of demographic changes, have had more of this earlier, right, than the East Coast, interestingly enough, right? And so this dynamic of students fighting across ethnic and race lines, this has been a California specific dynamic for quite some time. And when the problem solvers, if you will, went in there, part of what they discovered, right, is that for many of these young people, they have no understanding of each other's racial positioning, right? That is to say, there are presumptions about one group thinking that's better than the other group. There are presumptions about the lack of victimology, that each of them experience. Right? So in other words, just like adults can suffer from a lack of racial literacy, so can young people. And I mean, I don't claim to have like the magic wand, but it seems to me that it is certainly a necessary beginning, right, for these sort of peace sessions amongst the young people to be about educating themselves regarding sort of world histories and racialized and ethnic origin histories. That goes a long way to creating a space of sort of mutuality and mutual respect.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. I think that's all we're gonna present today as far as questions. Unless there's anything more you want, I don't know if you want to have any closing remarks at all, Professor Hernandez. If not, you want to?
Just to say thank you for inviting me. And for me, as a lawyer, it's always very exciting to be in a space where I'm in community with the folks doing the God's work as far as working on issues of anti-discrimination. I know it's not easy. I know it's particularly not easy in this particular historical moment, but it is just an honor, to be able to spend a little time with you. And I respect you all very much and wish you the very best. From the investigators to the paralegals to the secretaries, everybody, all of you are sort of contributing to getting this stuff done.
Thank you. And we still have our Executive Director Lassiter with us. Did you want to say anything also, Executive Director Lassiter?
I think the great professor just summed it up. We do God's work, and God is on the side of those who have been marginalized and oppressed, and we continue to soar for justice, even in the midst of this dark time that we find ourselves in. This too shall pass. It's going to be difficult because there are a lot of problems with the current construct of our democracy. Thank you so much. My Chief of Staff and I look forward to coming to New York, as I stated in the aforementioned, to spend some time with you. There's some other synergies that we're thinking about. I will leave this space by saying, for Devin Price, reach out to your colleagues at the PHRC. We have civil rights and human rights clubs in various schools with a curriculum that addresses a lot of what you spoke about. So once again, looking forward to seeing you in the near future, and ending by saying thank you for all of those of you who availed yourselves to be in this virtual beloved community space. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you all.